Mike Sheridan here. In today's video, I'm going to talk about why a vegan diet is a huge mistake. In all seriousness, many individuals gravitate towards a meat-free or vegan diet because they've been convinced it's healthier, when in reality it's leaving them nutrient deficient and struggling with unintended health consequences. First off, I want to talk about why people opt for a vegan or vegetarian diet in the first place. Generally, this boils down to three reasons. One, they think it's healthier. Two, they think it's better for the environment. And three, they don't believe it's right to kill and eat animals. And obviously, I can't argue with reason number three. However, what I hope to do is help these individuals fully understand the consequences or opportunity cost of that decision, because sadly many people don't understand what they're actually giving up to prioritize those feelings. In most cases, aspiring vegans are taught to believe they can produce an equivalent diet without animal products, when in reality they can't. And this is where we're going to start today, because this is the overlying principle that one should refer to whenever debating whether eating meat or not eating meat is healthy. But before I do that, I want to mention that this discussion on whether or not a vegan or vegetarian diet is healthier will be two parts, with today's video focusing on what the meat-free diet is lacking and how trying to acquire these nutrients with plants does more harm than good, and video number 2 talking about the misleading evidence suggesting that a diet containing meat is less healthy than a diet without, largely because of research presented and overly promoted on heart disease and cancer. I also hope to put out a third video in the future to tackle the final vegan plant-based claim surrounding the environment, although my ultimate hope is that you don't have to make it to part 3 or even part 2 after today's video. As like I said, these initial points establish a set of first principles that should be referenced against any future claims, ultimately highlighting why animal products are an essential part of a healthy diet for humans and not a replaceable part. So with that said, let's get into the information, which starts with a discussion on what we're supposed to eat as human beings and essentially what transitioned us from monkey to human when looking at evolution. You should be seeing a chart on your screen now of the brain or skull development of primates over time. And you're probably wondering what sparked this massive brain development. Well, the evidence tells us that this transition occurred as we incorporated more and more animal products into the diet. And since it's clear that monkeys are predominantly vegetarian while humans are omnivores, this makes a lot of sense. The other thing that's clear is that these animal products have nutrients in them that are specifically beneficial for cognitive performance and not found in plant foods, or as we'll discuss shortly, are present in plant foods, but not in the form humans require for proper functioning. So, to reiterate, we got consistently bigger brains with a higher presence of animal foods in the diet. Yet those opting to avoid meat or consume a diet completely devoid of animal products are telling us it's healthier? For me, this point alone would make me question my choice to go vegan, regardless of any future arguments. But nevertheless, I'll go ahead and continue. The next chart you should be seeing is the plant-to-animal ratios of worldwide hunter-gatherers, who chronologically fall somewhere in between the apes and humans we just discussed, and represent our oldest known relative or ancestor. As you can see, a lot of these hunter-gatherers ate a diet very heavily skewed towards animal-based foods, with upwards of 70% of them having animal foods represent more than 50% of their diet, almost as if they understood how critical these animal foods were. But more importantly, even the tribes eating lower percentages of animal foods were still eating a good amount, and none were eating 0%. So, to recap again, and before going too far down the road of why a vegan or vegetarian diet is less healthy than a diet containing animal foods, we're looking at monkeys with big metabolically expensive guts and smaller brains gradually evolving into more intelligent humans with smaller guts and bigger brains because of increased animal foods in the diet. And we see that the earliest forms of humans relied on a combination of plant and animal foods, with most eating a higher percentage of animal foods and none relying on plants entirely. Outside of that, and I don't want to elaborate too much on the hunter-gatherers, but as I mentioned, there's plenty of additional evidence to suggest that they prioritize these animal foods, and more specifically, the organ meats, bone marrow, and fat. Likely because they understood how vital these foods were nutritionally, which leads me to my next image, showing exactly what essential nutrients are abundant in animal foods, but impossible to acquire from plants. Sadly, there are additional considerations for vegans and meat avoiders, but these would be considered the big four, and in my opinion should provide more than enough deterrence to go vegan or vegetarian. Not only because of their importance in achieving and maintaining optimal health and performance for humans, but because of the devastating short and long-term consequences that come from deficiency. First, I'll go through each one of these essentials, then I'll touch on 5 additional considerations and explain the problems with trying to match any or all of these with alternative sources, usually in excessive amounts. The first is retinol, or preformed vitamin A, which can only be accessed directly from animal source foods, whereas the plant-based carotenoids, or provitamin A, is poorly converted to the usable form for humans, with anywhere from 0 to 3% of it making the transition. Next up is Cobalamin, which is the form of B12 humans require and can only be obtained from animal products. The plant-based form B12, Cobamide, does not convert to cobalamin and actually blocks its absorption. Number 3 of the big four is DHA and EPA, which are the long-chain omega-3s that humans require, and these can only be obtained from seafood and the fat of grazing animals. Yes, vegans can acquire omega-3s, but the plant-based form ALA is poorly converted to EPA and DHA, if at all. Last but not least is iron, and more specifically heme iron, which is the best available source for humans and obtained from animal source foods, notably red meat. Non-heme iron is the only type found in plant sources, and it's poorly absorbed by humans. So to reiterate, there are 4 essential nutrients human beings require for optimal health that vegans are not obtaining from food, with B12 and DHA really jumping off the screen for me because these are the nutrients that have a direct impact on the health and performance of your brain. And I'd argue have a lot to do with the cognitive development we discussed earlier that transitioned us from ape to human. How bad is this deficiency? Well, according to the evidence, when compared to omnivores, vegetarians have 30% lower DHA and EPA levels on average, and vegans 50 to 60% lower. With respect to B12, research has shown B12 deficiency in 77% of vegetarians and 92% of vegans, compared to 11% in omnivores. And sure, I'm a rational guy when it comes to this discussion, so I'm not going to tell you that you can't acquire some of these nutrients via supplementation, but I think you also need to be realistic with yourself in questioning whether a diet lacking these essentials and requiring excessive supplementation is healthier than a diet that includes them, and whether dealing with deficiency in the nutrients we've had in our diet since becoming human over 1 million years ago is a wise decision. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that the supplementation required to increase some of these nutrients, like DHA and retinol, would need to be derived from an animal source, like cod liver oil. So realistically, you'll either have to cave on the animal source supplement or deal with the deficiency in your vegan pursuits. Similarly, if you're trying to supplement with synthetic nutrients to work your way out of deficiency, it's important to recognize that you may be creating other issues, which I won't elaborate on here, but basically boils down to creating imbalances that increase needs elsewhere and potentially increase risks elsewhere. In any case, let's move on to the list of additional considerations for those attempting to match an omnivorous diet without consuming animal products. And let's keep in mind what I said before, and what I'll touch on shortly, is that a lot of these deficiencies are made worse, and overall health made worse, when individuals seek out non-meat alternatives in excessive amounts. First up is choline, which is also a brain-feeding nutrient that requires animal products to hit an adequate daily amount, with research suggesting this is upwards of 400 milligrams per day. The plant-based sources like cruciferous vegetables and some nuts and seeds do not provide enough to hit this amount, and this is before considering how much choline from these sources is actually absorbed. Next up is CLA, which I almost included in the essentials section, but technically it isn't classified as essential, so we'll talk about it here. The reason it was almost included there is because vegans and vegetarians cannot acquire this omega-6 fatty acid unless they seek out a vegetable oil that's been chemically altered to include it. And I don't think I need to elaborate on why that's an issue, but the important takeaway here is that animal fat contains substances like CLA that are extremely beneficial from a disease prevention perspective. And sadly, CLA often flies under the radar in this discussion, even though its ratio with the plant-based omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid, appears to have a direct impact on cancer and heart disease risk. While we're on the topic of animal fat, the other critical components of fat are the fat-soluble nutrients, and more specifically, the ones that are nearly impossible to obtain from non-animal sources, or rarely obtained because those foods are rarely consumed. When it comes to vitamin D, sun exposure is obviously the best source, but omnivores benefit more than vegans and vegetarians from the diet because seafood, organ meats, egg yolks, and dairy products contain notable amounts, while vegans only appear to be able to get vitamin D in their diet from a handful of mushroom varieties. Vitamin K2 is a similar story, but potentially more of a concern given that the K1 variety found in plants is poorly converted to the K2 in animal fat that humans require, similar to vitamin A, and given that there's no alternative source like the sun for vitamin D. Vegans and vegetarians can acquire vitamin K2 from a food source called natto, which is fermented soy. But as we'll discuss shortly, soy is a problematic food on its own, especially when you're relying on it as a dietary staple. With respect to minerals, I won't mention the specifics for vegans and vegetarians in acquiring what I've listed here, calcium, zinc, and iodine, compared to omnivores. But what I want to talk about is the bigger problem, which is that the actual absorbable nutrients aren't what we see on paper. I'm going to elaborate on this after we go through the list, but basically the anti-nutrients found in plant matter, like phytates and lectins, disrupt absorption in general, effectively increasing the need for a mineral that's already difficult to obtain, and one could argue make other minerals outside of the three I've listed a concern as well. For instance, research has suggested that even when vegetarians are able to consume higher amounts of iron, they're lucky to achieve half the iron levels of omnivores, predominantly because the plant-based iron is poorly absorbed compared to the animal-based iron, but also because the heavy reliance on plant-based alternatives that are filled with anti-nutrients reduces absorption in the gut, with some evidence actually showing that vegetarians and vegans exhibit 70 to 85% less absorption compared to omnivores. Not surprisingly, it's the same story with amino acids, which I don't want to elaborate on individually, similar to minerals, because this is also a big picture problem. For example, although I only highlighted taurine, methionine, and glycine on my list, one could also make a case for lysine, leucine, and tryptophan, as well as the downstream effects that occur when individuals aren't getting adequate amounts of these nutrients for the various processes the body uses them for. Whether that's glycine and methionine to get creatine, or glycine and methionine for proper detoxification. In both instances, initial deficiencies are causing other deficiencies and leading to health consequences for vegans and vegetarians. All that said, the part I do want to elaborate on is this idea that the inadequate protein and amino acids topic has been debunked because of vegan bodybuilders, high-level athletes, world's strongest men, and other anecdotal observations from vegans and vegetarians. And I'll try not to digress too much, but the reality is someone excelling in sports has very little to do with whether they eat meat or don't. They're going to excel because they have genetic gifts that make them a fantastic athlete, or they put exceptional effort into their craft to compete at the highest level. Would they have gotten there with an all-meat diet? Probably. Would they have performed even better if they had meat in their diet? Well, based on what we've discussed so far, more than likely. But realistically, there's no way to tell, so suggesting that it's the reason is ridiculous. Or as I like to say, it's equivalent to saying Usain Bolt is the world's fastest man because he ate chicken McNuggets the entire time he was in Beijing. Or unrelated to sports, but Steve Jobs had the mental fortitude to create one of the biggest and most successful companies in the world because of his all-fruit diet. But back to the point I really want to get across here with protein and amino acids, which is that a vegan can definitely eat enough protein from non-meat sources and supplementation, but it's extremely difficult given the available sources, and more importantly, it's likely causing unnecessary damage that's probably going to negatively affect their long-term health if it's not already negatively affecting their health in the short term. And here's why. The available evidence suggests that a minimum daily requirement for protein from all sources is 0.6 grams per pound of body weight on average. And I do my best to emphasize the word minimum when I say that, because this means 0.6 grams per pound of body weight is the absolute lowest amount you should be eating on a daily basis to ensure your body has enough to execute the basic functions it's involved in and the mental and physical demands you place on it. Realistically, most individuals have trouble hitting the lower threshold of that minimum amount with meat in their diet, but swap out the animal protein and now we're really struggling. For instance, here's a sample day from an above average 220-pound male eating 3 meals per day with a sizable portion of animal protein, in addition to a couple salads and some mixed nuts for snacking. Fortunately, he manages to hit the minimum daily requirement for protein, but note how critical the animal protein is to doing that, with the 4 eggs, 6-ounce pork tenderloin, and 6-ounce chicken breast accounting for 120 grams of the 150 grams he consumed that day. But look what happens when we swap out those animal proteins for grains and legumes, keeping in mind that I've chosen options on the higher protein side, and I'm being quite generous on quantities. Plus, note the increase in mixed nuts and veggies by 1 cup in addition to the protein swap. As you can see, we're still undershooting minimum daily protein even before getting into how much of this protein is actually absorbed in comparison to the more bioavailable animal proteins. And most importantly, what these 3 cups of beans, 3 cups of grains, and 2 cups of nuts actually mean for your health. Generally speaking, animal sources tend to be more easily absorbed and utilized, with bioavailability scores ranging from 80 to 100% in meat, fish, and dairy products, while non-meat sources or plant sources like grains and beans are lucky to fetch 75, and many actually falling under 50%. So even if we're being generous by saying 25% less absorption or bioavailability in plants, this means that 150 grams we showed for the vegetarian diet is more like 86 grams of protein, or 0.4 grams per pound of body weight, which is not nearly enough protein to maintain good health, especially as our maintenance needs increase with age. But all that said, the bigger picture here with eating these excessive amounts of grains, beans, and seeds in hopes of consuming enough protein is the impact on your overall health, since all of this plant matter exposes you to far too many lectins, phytates, oxalates, and the various other anti-nutrients that are present in these foods. And sure, you can try to soak, germinate, and sprout these foods to diminish some of these toxins, but you don't fully eliminate them, as illustrated with the two research clippings I put on the screen. Or reduce them to a level where 6 cups of grains and legumes, 2 cups of nuts and seeds, and 6 cups of veggies isn't harmful, especially when it's in the context of a diet that's already deficient in essential nutrients. Or put another way, it's not that these foods can't be prepared in a way that makes them less damaging than they would otherwise be. It's that these lengthy preparation practices that most will not take part in don't make up for the excessive quantities required to try and acquire adequate nutrients and protein. This is why rickets and osteoporosis is extremely common in populations that rely heavily on grains and beans, and this is why vegan and vegetarian children often fail to grow and develop as well as their omnivorous counterparts. For instance, there was a case study in 1980 that compared two prehistoric populations living in the same area but with significantly different nutritional habits. The villagers or agriculturalists lived mainly on corn, beans, and squash, and the hunter-gatherers mostly meat, fish, and wild fruit. And after researchers analyzed the health of both populations, they found many deficiencies in the low or no meat eaters that caused noticeable disruptions in development. But perhaps more important is that this heavy reliance on grains and beans is setting vegans and vegetarians up for a lifetime struggle with inflammatory bowel issues, cognitive and neurological disorders, and various hormonal problems, since the undigestible roughage in these foods damages the gastrointestinal lining. The proteins in these foods promote inflammation and disrupt hormones, and the anti-nutrients promote deficiencies, as we just discussed. Not to mention the blood sugar, insulin, and additional implications of eating a low-fat, low-protein, high-carb diet. And before elaborating on the disease risks that come with some of the imbalances mentioned above, from inadequate animal-derived omega-3 fats and CLA, certain amino acids and mineral deficiencies, and the fat-soluble nutrients that cannot be acquired elsewhere. I plan to elaborate on all of that more in part 2, but before I let you go, I want to mention one more consideration with respect to this argument that vegans and vegetarians can acquire equivalent nutrition. And that's a reality that these low or no meat eaters will not consume a diet that's as healthy as the one I shared in this presentation, and even less will take part in the tedious preparation procedures required to remove some of the anti-nutrients present in these alternative protein sources. With most meat avoiders, especially the newfound ones, living on chips and crackers and scarfing down candy, junk food, and fake meat as they struggle with this health-damaging, unsustainable pursuit that goes against what their human body requires and has always required. Point being, I think I've been overly generous with what constitutes a vegan or plant-based diet, and as you can see, it's in no way healthier than a diet with meat, hence the reason we've been consuming meat as long as we have. And sure, you can supplement some of these inadequacies, but other than the issues I've mentioned already with supplementation, doesn't that just highlight my point? You're going to make up for this lack of nutrients with 12 supplements and 3 servings of pea protein powder per day? If this type of solution is required, it's not healthier than a diet that doesn't require this irrational behavior. And frankly, after you've watched this video, I don't think I should have to explain why that's the case. We've always eaten animal foods. That's where we acquire the essential nutrients we need to thrive as human beings, and any diet lacking these animal foods is less healthy than one that contains them. Thanks for watching.